With all of the talk about presidential politics, it's easy to forget that all 201 state legislative seats will be on the ballot next month. Some of these races are incredibly competitive, with significant funds being spent to sway voters, as control of both the Senate and House chambers is potentially up for grabs. Joining me now to talk about the DFL efforts to retain control of the Senate is Majority Leader Tom Bakk. Thanks for being here.
I'm happy to be with you.
Many Minnesotans are frustrated by the so-called do-nothing session from 2016. Some of that frustration may transform itself into a change in the status quo. What is your caucus doing to convince voters that DFL should maintain the majority in the Senate?
Well, first let me say I think the Senate is viewed a little differently by the public than the House is. And the interesting kind of little fun fact is, in the last 5 elections, the House majority has flipped 4 times. Mm-hmm. The Senate, since statehood, has flipped 3 times. Mm-hmm. I think the Senate, the public views the Senate a little differently. It really is where the state's stability has been at the Capitol over since statehood. Right. And we've had Democratic governors and Republican governors and wrestler governors, and we've had a pretty stable Senate over the decades. And so those of us that are members of the Senate feel pretty proud about the contribution the Senate has made, that no matter how the politics ebbs and flows in Minnesota, the Senate is the place that kind of becomes the normalizing factor, and Minnesota's continued to grow and prosper over the decades. Mm-hmm. But we're leaving nothing to chance. We've got 39 members in our caucus. We need 34 to have the majority. Mm-hmm. We've recruited very, very good candidates in some open seats. There's always some incumbents that are in question, mm-hmm. but there's some open seats that we think we've got very strong candidates in. I think the public understands that special sessions aren't so special anymore.
Yeah. That
they just people negotiate right up to the wire, and sometimes things don't come together. Mm-hmm. And it's been getting a little bit more difficult over time, and some of that, frankly, is the fault of the political parties or the individuals that participate in the precinct caucuses. It just seems like over time, in some places, not everywhere, but in some places, you just can't be conservative enough. I mean, mm-hmm. and the perfect example is mm-hmm. the Speaker had a primary of his own this year.
Yes, he
right?
did.
Kurt's a pretty conservative guy, mm-hmm. but obviously some people back in his district thought he wasn't conservative enough. Mm-hmm. And the same thing happened in the Senate. We had, there are people have primaries, and you have to get through that. So it's real hard in election years once you adjourn, when the entire legislature starts to get a little skittish about the election.
Sure.
Even people in safe seats, I get calls from them, oh my gosh, this is what my opponent's doing, and people feel really strongly about their service and they want to continue, sure. and they've got things they've been working on that they still want to close the deal on, so they want to come back. So mm-hmm. It's very, very hard, and I would say not unusual to not be able to negotiate a special session in an election year.
Right.
Because everybody's kind of on the edge of their chairs, and this year was especially hard because it was very hard for the Speaker to compromise with myself and the Governor when he was facing a primary of his own in August. Mm-hmm. And then, once you get into August and into the state fair, then right. I think special sessions start to look political. Mm-hmm. So I think we just got delayed because of the Speaker's primary, and then it just kind of got too late.
Right.
So a number of people have come to me recently and said, Tom, you think there's, rather than leave this leftover work from the 2016 session and have it get bogged down in the budget year in 17, right. Is there any way we maybe could do a special session after the election with the...
Is that an option?
Well, sure. I mean, the Governor could call one at any time, You know, the bills, you know, the tax bill had a lot of votes. I mean, almost 100 votes in the House, I think, and a strong bipartisan vote in the Senate. The advantage of that would be the bill is something that everybody's familiar with. They worked on it last session. I think once you get to January, and you've got probably 40 new legislators between the House and the Senate going to be sworn in, who had no hand and know little or nothing about what's in the bill. It's pretty hard, I think, to bring a bill up and ask people to vote for it when they didn't participate in the process of putting it together at all. So I think if anything could happen relative to that, and I know there's people talking about, well, gee, can you do it first thing in January? I just don't think that's fair to the new members that are coming in. So I think it's more, probably more appropriate to try and do it in November if you're going to do it.
So right after the election, you would consider a special session to take care of some of these things.
You know, once the politics is kind of out of the air, I think cooler tempers will prevail. And
do you think members who possibly lost their seats would want to cooperate, though?
Well, I mean, if you're going out the door, I mean, there's, you know, I can just tell you in the tax bill, there is very little disagreement about provisions. There's a lot of very, very good work went into that, both on the part of the House and the Senate. And I think, you know, if you were somebody that lost and you knew there was a lot of good stuff in there, it seems like kind of going out the door, hey, why don't I get some good stuff done, rather than not.
Well, and then what about transportation? I mean, last session, the DFL platform was a dedicated funding source, either by raising gas tax or license tab fees. And instead, some transportation projects were inserted into the bonding bill, which failed. So is your platform to try to go back to a dedicated funding source for transportation for those projects that haven't been moving?
Well, there was not a transportation bill that passed. The House made a decision to try to put some earmark some projects in the bonding bill and use cash for that, general fund cash. The problem with trying to use general fund for transportation, and I know there's a strong appetite on the part of some people that, well, you've got some surplus money, why don't you use it on transportation? That's not a plan. I mean that is a Band-Aid to do a few projects around the state. The state needs a long-term transportation infrastructure plan. We've got crumbling infrastructure all over the state, and using a little money in a year where there's a surplus to try and put a Band-Aid on a few projects, I think the public expects more of us than that. Transportation has always been funded through a constitutionally dedicated revenue stream. So the legislature cannot tinker with that money. So the gas tax that you pay, the license tabs that you pay, the sales tax on your motor vehicles when you buy one, all is constitutionally dedicated to go to transportation. So the legislature can't spend on anything else. And the challenge with trying to move towards spending general fund money is this is a budget year coming up, and everything will be on the table. And you can't build a long-term transportation plan based on general fund spending, because when January comes and we start putting a new state budget together for the next 2 years, all that general fund money is in competition. And roads and bridges will have to compete with K-12 and early childhood and health care and economic development and everything else in the state budget. And it'll take a back seat. Transportation spending, because those projects can get delayed, will always take a back seat to putting money into nursing homes and health care and into education and putting money into higher ed to help hold tuition down. It'll get delayed. So it will never get done with general fund money. And that's just not my observation. I mean, the Highway Trust Fund was constitutionally passed, oh gosh, I don't know, 100 years ago, before we had many cars even. Legislators knew that it would just never compete with other things in the budget, so it needed to be constitutionally dedicated money. So the Senate has advocated in both 2013 and again in 2015 for some additional dedicated revenue that can be spent only on roads and bridges. And we haven't been successful yet. We weren't successful in 2013 when we had a Democratic House. We weren't successful in 15 when we had a Republican House. But it will continue to be a priority for the Senate to continue to work on building, repairing the state's public infrastructure.
So we're almost out of time, but I do want to get your thoughts on how presidential candidate Donald Trump is doing on the Iron Range, because some polling is showing that he's doing well, and some of that is due to the volatility in the mining industry. So as quickly as you can you talk about that?
Today, the day we're taping this show and the day it's going to show, he's probably doing fairly well, better than a Republican would. By November 8th, I think he will have collapsed on the Iron Range. Once the stories start to break about all of his economic development projects, his huge towers that he's built around the country, that he's set up shell companies in order to buy foreign Chinese steel to bring it into this country. Once people on the Iron Range start to learn who Donald Trump really is, and that all this tough talk on trade is all just presidential politics to pander to voters in Ohio and in Pennsylvania. Iron Rangers are pretty smart people, and they're going to realize that he's just not being honest with us about how he really feels about trade. This tie is made in the United States, and I'm pretty proud of it. I know his isn't.
Senator Bakk, we have to stop there, but I want to thank you for coming today.
Thank you very much.